Hello, friends. Welcome to Storycraft. On this channel, you will enjoy world top stories. Let's view the video. The real story of Black Prince of England born for glory, the rise of Edward the Black Prince. In the early 14th century, a child was born who would grow to become one of the most legendary military leaders in English history. Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, entered the world on June 15, 1330, at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire. He was the eldest son of King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainaut. As the heir apparent to the English throne, his birth was a national celebration, seen as the continuation of a powerful dynasty that sought to expand England's influence across Europe. From a young age, Edward was groomed for greatness. He was given the finest education available to a royal, learning not just chivalric codes and courtly manners, but also Latin, law, military strategy, and theology. He was exposed to the workings of court politics early, observing his father lead England into a new era of power. It was clear that this boy was not destined for a quiet life in the shadows of the crown. He was to become a warrior, a leader, and perhaps a king. The England of Edward's youth was a land in transition. Feudalism still reigned, but the seeds of nationalism and centralized power were being sown. Edward III, his father, was a charismatic and ambitious monarch who sought to reclaim what he believed were his rightful lands in France. This claim would spark the infamous 100 Years' War, and Edward the Black Prince would become its most celebrated icon. By the age of 7, Edward had been made the Earl of Chester. At 13, he was created Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, and Earl of Chester. These titles weren't merely ceremonial, they were signs that the young prince was being prepared to rule. He was placed under the tutelage of seasoned knights and military commanders who would teach him the art of war. Edward's early years were marked by immense pressure, but also privilege. He was deeply admired for his intelligence, charm, and especially his sense of justice. Stories of his early exploits, even before he lifted a sword in battle, began circulating through the kingdom, painting a picture of a born leader. His armor, which was said to be black, possibly due to its color, or the black surcoat he wore, began to give him the name that history would remember, the Black Prince. By the time he reached his teenage years, Edward was more than a symbol of England's future. He was already being cast as a hero in the making, but no one could predict just how legendary his journey would become. The Warrior Prince. Triumph at the Battle of Crécy. The year was 1346, and Edward was only 16 years old when he first tasted battle. It wasn't a skirmish or a raid. It was one of the most defining clashes of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crécy. Here, in the lush countryside of northern France, the young prince would prove himself not just as a royal figurehead, but as a commanding leader and a warrior of unmatched valor. King Edward III led the English forces, but he entrusted the right flank of his army to his teenage son. It was a daring move that raised eyebrows across both camps. Could a boy lead men into battle? Would he falter under the weight of war? The answers would be written in blood on the fields of Crécy. The English army was outnumbered. The French, led by King Philip VI, had superior numbers and cavalry. Yet, Edward's forces held the advantage of terrain, discipline, and technology. The longbow, a weapon that would become synonymous with English dominance, rained devastation upon the French knights. As the battle raged, Edward stood firm, his black armor gleaming amidst the chaos. French charges were repelled again and again. At one point, seeing his son under immense pressure, King Edward was urged to send reinforcements. His response became legendary. Let the boy win his spurs, and win them he did. Edward fought with a courage that stunned veterans and inspired his men. By the end of the day, thousands of French lay dead, including many nobles. The English had secured a monumental victory, and the Black Prince emerged as a national hero. The Battle of Crécy was more than just a military triumph. It was Edward's rite of passage. The prince had transformed from a royal promise into a living legend. His reputation soared across Europe. Chroniclers wrote of his bravery, comparing him to the great knights of old. His enemies feared him. His allies revered him. In the years that followed, Edward continued to campaign in France. He proved to be a strategist of remarkable skill, mastering the art of mobile warfare and siege tactics. But it was Crécy that would forever define his image. It was where the Black Prince was truly born, not in Woodstock Palace, but on a battlefield soaked in glory and fire. A hero in France, the Prince and the 100 Years' War, following the triumph at Crécy, Edward the Black Prince's role in the 100 Years' War intensified. No longer just the heir to the English throne, he became a field commander who carried the ambitions of an empire on his shoulders. In 1355, he led a daring chevauchée, a fast-moving raid, across southern France. This campaign was brutal, strategic, and highly effective, aiming to disrupt French logistics, demoralize the population, and force the enemy into open battle. Edward's force of around 6,000 men moved swiftly through the French countryside, burning villages, destroying crops, and capturing towns. These raids weren't senseless acts of violence. They were calculated strikes meant to cripple the French economy and provoke a decisive encounter. In 1356, near the town of Poitiers, that encounter came. At the Battle of Poitiers, the French outnumbered the English again. But Edward used his superior tactics and discipline to devastating effect. He chose a strong defensive position, forcing the French to attack uphill against his longbowmen and dismounted knights. When the French cavalry broke upon the English line, the slaughter began. It was here that Edward achieved his greatest military triumph. Not only did he win the battle, but he also captured King John II of France and his son. The French monarchy was thrown into chaos. Edward treated the captured king with honor, earning the respect even of his enemies. This victory gave Edward almost mythical status. He returned to England with King John in chains, hailed as the greatest knight of his age. The ransom for the king helped fund further campaigns and bolster England's dominance. Edward's chivalry, charisma, and martial brilliance made him the epitome of a perfect prince. After Poitiers, Edward was granted the Duchy of Aquitaine. He moved to Bordeaux and began ruling as a quasi-king in his own right. But administration brought new challenges. Governing a war-torn land was not like leading a charge into battle. Discontent among his subjects and high taxation strained his reputation. Still, his court in Bordeaux became a center of culture and nobility. The Black Prince's role in France was not just as a warrior, but also as a ruler. He tried to enforce English law and maintain order in a volatile region. However, as his campaigns continued, cracks began to show. The war dragged on, alliances shifted, and Edward's health started to decline. But for nearly a decade, he held the south of France in the palm of his hand, a living symbol of English strength. Shadows of power, politics, plague, and betrayal by the 1360s, the legend of the Black Prince began to darken. Once hailed as the flower of chivalry, Edward now faced the burdens of prolonged war, political intrigue, and personal suffering. His health, always a point of concern, began to deteriorate rapidly. Some suggest he contracted dysentery during a campaign in Spain. Others say it was a form of tuberculosis. Whatever the illness, it left him weakened and in constant pain. Despite his condition, Edward took part in the Castilian Civil War, backing Pedro the Cruel against his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. The 1367 Battle of Nájera was a tactical victory for Edward, but it came at a steep cost. His forces suffered heavily, and Pedro failed to repay the massive expenses Edward had incurred. It was a hollow win, and it marked the beginning of his decline. Back in Aquitaine, unrest was brewing. Heavy taxation to fund Edward's campaigns bred resentment. The once-loved prince became a figure of blame. When the towns of Limoges rebelled, Edward reacted with uncharacteristic cruelty. The city was besieged, and upon its fall, a massacre ensued. Chronicles report that over 3,000 people were killed, including civilians. Some historians debate the numbers, but the event scarred Edward's legacy. Edward's health worsened, and he was forced to return to England. There, the court was no refuge. Political factions had grown in his absence. His younger brother, John of Gaunt, began consolidating power, and Parliament grew increasingly wary of royal authority. The Prince of Wales, once the brightest star of England, was now caught in a web of court politics. In 1376, he summoned the strength to make one final appearance in Parliament to plead for reforms and protect the interests of his young son, Richard. His speech was powerful, but it was also a farewell. On June 8, 1376, Edward the Black Prince died at the age of 45. He had never become king. His death was mourned across the realm. His body was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, where his tomb still stands, adorned with the helmet, gauntlets, and sword of a warrior prince. But his passing marked the end of an era. The golden age of chivalry was fading, and England was about to descend into internal strife. Legacy of the Black Prince, the forgotten heir to the throne. Edward the Black Prince left behind more than just a trail of battlefield victories. He embodied the ideal of the medieval knight, brave, loyal, and just. Yet, his story is one of tragic unfulfillment. He was destined to be king, but never wore the crown. His young son, Richard II, would ascend the throne, but lack his father's strength and charisma. The prince's military successes echoed through history. His tactics were studied by generals for generations. His black armor became a symbol of fear and honor. And yet, his reputation was complex. He was a hero to the English, a villain to the French, and a man who struggled under the weight of expectation and illness. In time, the Black Prince faded into the background of history, overshadowed by kings and conquerors who came after. But to those who delve into the past, his story remains one of the most compelling narratives of medieval Europe. A prince born for greatness, tested by war, broken by duty, and remembered by legend. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, a name that once shook empires, now whispers through the pages of time. Legacy of the Black Prince, the forgotten heir to the throne. Richard II's reign would be plagued by rebellion, favoritism, and eventual deposition. Many historians speculate how different England's history might have been had Edward lived to become king. Would he have united the nobility? Would he have continued the military successes of his youth? Such questions remain unanswered, locked in the realm of speculation and historical what-ifs. Yet despite never ascending the throne, Edward the Black Prince's influence endured. His military tactics were studied for generations. His chivalric reputation became a model for English knights. Even Shakespeare referenced him in his works, elevating him to near mythical status. Edward's emblem, the 3 ostrich feathers with the motto Ich dien, German for I serve, became associated with the Prince of Wales, a tradition that continues to this day. His black armor, dramatic on the battlefield and symbolic in history, created an image of a fearsome but noble warrior, a prince who fought for glory, duty, and legacy. But perhaps the most enduring part of Edward's story is the duality of his legend. He was both a lion and a man, a warrior who brought kings to their knees, and a father who died before he could secure the future of his lineage. His life was a crescendo of glory, yet his death left a silence that echoed through English history. Though time has moved on, and other monarchs have risen and fallen, the story of the Black Prince remains. His armor rests in Canterbury, his deeds are written in chronicles, and his name, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, still commands respect. Nearly 7 centuries after he last rode into battle, He was the king England never had, but perhaps the one it truly needed. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Storycraft for more interesting videos.